Hello, dear audience. We are continuing our Feast of Healthy Thoughts, the shows that we have started almost a year ago, and we are very happy to be with you. I want you to remember what is the goal of this show, to remind you the explanations of the topic. The Feast of Healthy Thoughts, we decided to name the show Feast of Healthy Thoughts because of two reasons. I have a very good friend who always mentions that we have to come together instead of around food, around beautiful ideas and thoughts. And that comes from one of the Armenian authors who says that it's enough to party with food, we have to start partying with ideas and great thoughts. So our party here is about beautiful ideas, great thoughts. And I want to add to this a little nuance. When we started our conversations with Presbytera, she added a little nuance to it, which is conversations on the theme. So when I was thinking this morning to come to the studio, I was thinking about this, that these shows are not only healthy thoughts, random healthy thoughts, that can be about anything, but they are turning into conversations on a theme. We turned the thoughts towards the theme that we are conversing about. We are talking about the narrow gate, the gate that takes to Christ, and theme himself is Christ to me. And that narrow gate is not very attractive and it needs a lot of attention. So I want to emphasize this, that these shows may not be very attractive for many people, but we find it very important, and shows like this have to be more done. So the message about the theme and the thoughts that are healthy have to be served to our people. Today we have decided to speak about humility. One of the Armenian patriarchs in his diaries writes about humility and says that humility is the most difficult virtue that a human being can gain, because the opposite of humility is pride, and the pride is the most dangerous sin. And he says that the relationship between these two is very unique. He says that the pride is so dangerous it can even hide behind humility. So this is a very difficult and very nuanced topic, and so we have Presbytera to give us spiritual advice about this virtue that is one of the most important. And I want to remember the prophecy about Christ, that he came to be slaughtered as a lamb. That was one of his main characteristics, to be the most humble one. And as we mentioned in one of our last conversations, he bent down and washed the feet of his disciples to give them the best example how to be. And he says, whoever serves is the first among you. Presbytera, welcome to our following conversation, and as we decided, we're going to speak about this important virtue. What is the first thought that you have about this, about humility? Give us the first idea that comes to your mind when you hear about humility.
Well, right now, nothing that I wrote down that I came prepared to reflect on with you and everyone. And I think it's because, as you were describing humility and how Jesus, as we Christians believe that he is God, had the humility, in fact, an extreme humility to, as God, become human, to become one with us, a phenomenon that in the universe had not happened before. That, well, it's kind of a crazy idea if you never heard of this idea before, to think that God would become human once and only once for the good of all. And so that all of creation, all of material and invisible and spiritual creation has been changed as a result of that. The term that is used in the scriptures to describe this awesome event, this mystery that we cannot explain, that we cannot get our minds around, is the term kenosis, which is a kind of radical self-emptying. That's what the Greek points to, and where the scripture says that Christ emptied himself to become human, emptied himself completely of what it meant for him to be the second person out there, wherever infinity or outside of infinity is, wherever God abides, to be one with us. And so that's what came to mind to me as you were describing. That kenosis is God's humility for us. And God is so desperately in love with us. God is so desperately focused, desiring our being with him. We as individual persons, we collectively as humanity, and we as the whole created universe, to be in communion with him, that he has become one of us. He has joined us in creation in a way that hasn't happened before. But I think that's also pointing to us an important clue about what we are supposed to do in return. That if we believe that God is a trinity of persons, which we Christians of a classical foundation believe, that the mystery of one God and three persons, how is that to be? Because 1 and 1 and 1 equals 1 in this strange mathematics, that the mystery of three persons being one, how do they do that? And so while we are not God and will never conceptualize or have the ability to understand that, what we have been taught through the love of God and through revelation is that the three are one due to love, and that they abide in one another in an eternal dance of love that is often called the perichoresis, where one, in Greek, where one is in the other without themselves being compromised. And so how does one become by meditating on these lessons that we're learning about how does a Trinity abide in one another, which is, if I can use more human language, a kind of surrender, a dance of surrender of love in one into the other, where one does not lose oneself in the other, but finds oneself in the other. A title of a very important book written by an Orthodox theologian called Being as Communion points us to that whole reality, that all of being, all that is communion. And to be ourselves, to become more ourselves, is to find our uniqueness that has been given to us by God in relationship with one another. Mm-hmm. That's immense, immense. And so how do we do that? How does that happen? Well, it happens by our kind of getting back to basics and opening ourselves up to one another and our own selves in the presence of God. That opening up begins the discipline of humility. What is humility? Humility is really just knowing ourselves, who we are in the presence of God. If I can, when you asked also, the second thought that came to my mind, what comes to your mind about our topic today, and I did not write that when I was writing my notes for our time together, but I scribbled it in so I don't forget it, is that another backdoor understanding of humility could be authentic self-knowledge in the presence of God. It's always in the presence of God. If it's knowledge cut off from God, well, we'll talk about that in a minute, okay?
I actually have a question like that, mm-hmm. because St. Paul says knowledge adds pride.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Boy, that pride, right? The first temptation. And we've been talking about that often through our visits together. Yes. That the toxic opposite, the poisonous opposite of humility, of self-knowledge, authentic, who we are in the presence of God, experience of knowledge is humility. And when we try to promote ourselves in a way that's inauthentic, not in the way that God has created us to do through our own cooperation and His love for us, then we are trying to, in some way or other, become God without God. And when we try to be God without God, that's an expression of pride. And so, and with pride being the source of the fall of Adam and Eve, which is something we've been saying off and on through our visits together, and that's the temptation through which they fell, and where sin, limitation, and death, and many other not so good things entered our reality. So humility and its backdoor explanation we can maybe call authentic self-knowledge in the presence of God. Why? Because to be humble, the word humility, is a Latin-based word which refers to being of the ground. Well, that's very accurate.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because all of us, all human beings, all creation, but especially now, let's think about human beings, are basically pieces of clay or specks of dust created in the image and likeness of God. Well, by paying attention to who we are, by being humble, we are basically getting back to basics. We are getting back to the truth of who we are. We are specks of dust, specks of clay created in the image and likeness of God. And so by paying attention to that, owning that, resting in that in the presence of God, makes us more receptive to God's love for us, and God's love for one another, and our love for one another, and all of creation. And so a nickname I have been playing with for humility is being right-sized in the presence of God.
Mm-hmm.
Right? When we are our truest selves in the moment, the context calls us to be, we are not too big, meaning not puffed up with grandiosity and pride, trying to be something false, which is a delusion, right? And not too little, which is also false, which paradoxically is also a delusion. Sometimes we can be so little, it's a kind of false pride, and that's not serving God either. So it's good saying being right-sized. Being right-sized in the presence of God makes us open to grow. Mm-hmm. To grow in the presence of God, to grow, to become more ourselves, who He has been calling us to be, in a way that we just have to show up and see what happens next.
I want to tell a small story here because it relates very closely, and then I want you to explain that. How does it work? How do you qualify yourself correctly? There is this story, I think it's about a Greek philosopher who was laying down in the middle of the road, and the mayor of the city was traveling, and he was on their way. So they come there, and the servants come and say, "Move out of the way, because the mayor is traveling and you're on his way." And he says, "No, I cannot move." And then he stays there so long that the mayor himself comes out, and they start discussing the problem. And the mayor says, "Who are you that you are not moving off my way?" And the philosopher turns to him and says, "Well, I cannot tell you who I am, but if you answer my question, you will find out. Who are you?" And he says, "I'm the mayor of the town." He says, "Well, who is above you?" He says, "Well, maybe the prince of the town or whoever, the area." And then after that, who is after that? He says, "Well, after that, so-and-so." And then finally they get to the king. He says, "That's the highest point." He says, "Well, what is after king?" He says, "Nothing." He said, "Well, that's the answer to your question. I am that nothing. Who is above everything. I have come to understand who I am. I am nothingness, and that's above everything, I think, and I'm not going to move out of your way because I'm higher than you are." And now, this type of self-knowledge, when you realize that you are nothing, you're a speck of dust, it can be self-deprecating, like one of the terms that you have used before in the discussions. How does one stay in the middle, not to self-deprecate himself and feel like I'm nothing, but feel like I'm nothing and I'm above all, like this philosopher? And that can also create pride.
Well, we could understand that story that you shared almost perfectly depicting this quick definition of humility, to appreciate that we are specks of dust, that we are specks of clay created in the image and likeness of God. We can't put our minds around that. Just saying that makes me crazy, and at the same time makes me ecstatically happy and joyful and hopeful about everything, about reality, about my reality, your reality. And so, but I can't put my mind around even that little statement. And so in that story, it's very a liberating kind of story, and it might have taught the arrogant mayor a little bit of a lesson about what does it mean for him to be more human and own who he is in the presence of reality, capital R. And so, but the self-deprecating part, I think, is also important for Christians to think about. And I think people who are of goodwill, who are not of our spiritual background, that when we grow in humility, we are powerless over how it's experienced by people around us. Sometimes it will seem as if it is self-deprecating or self-effacing, sometimes. And in the end, we are the final judges on that. But we have to be careful, because there is a kind of self-deprecating, there is a kind of self-judgment that instead of breeding openness and growth and more life, it breeds humiliation, intimidation, and a kind of life effacement. We become less ourselves. We have less life because we are calling ourselves junk. So it's very subtle. We're not junk. But at times being right-sized in the presence of God does not make sense around the context in which we find ourselves for the rest of our lives. And as we grow, that might change, and our context might change, but it's going not to look the same as we go through life.
Mm-hmm. I want to go to the reality of today's life. We know that the modern life, to some extent, is based on Darwinism, which at this moment I think is the opposite, because according to the evolution theory, the strongest survive and the weakest perish. And if we preach about humility, does it make us weak? Does it mean that we will perish because we didn't want to fight? We didn't want to survive according to our strength, but we kind of back up. And this is a very crucial point for some people. Even for Armenians, I have heard so many times that Christianity caused problems for the entire nation, even genocide and things like that, that they did not want to fight against. They surrendered because they didn't have anything to lose. Or in a personal life, if someone is humble, can be stepped on. Do you
You just said an enormous thing. And I struggle with this issue, especially lately, now that we are having these conversations and we are accountable for what we say. Mm-hmm. And in reading more about the Armenian genocide, wherever genocide happens, the genocides I know most about is the Jewish Holocaust that happened during World War II, and the many other millions of people that were also killed during World War II, but there was a specific vendetta against the Jewish people, just as there was a specific vendetta against the Armenian people in 1915, and in recent decades, the vendettas that have happened across the world that have sparked events of genocide. And people of Christian goodwill and people of other religious faiths of goodwill walking a discipline that also promotes humility. Survivors, all of them that I've gotten to know, at least through some of the literature, in all of these situations, there are people who say, never again. Mm-hmm. We will never again roll over and die. Which the rolling over and dying is perhaps, when it was happening, surrendering in humility, let's say. At least for the Christian and for the Jewish perspectives, that being humble in the presence of God is a very dominant theme in the spiritual life of the people. I don't know how to answer that. All I know is that I don't know, and I cannot excuse the kind of hatred that occurred and say it was good. But I can say, because I'm broken, and this is the best I can say, is that we are all, even so, in the palm of the loving God's hand. Even so, none of this happened outside the providence of God. Did God want millions and millions of people to be exterminated? Of course not. Did God desire murder and bloodshed and betrayal and the kind of subhuman behaviors that occurred to destroy so many lives and so much catastrophe in the world? No. At the same time, how are we still all, and all those souls that have been lost in the palm of the loving God's hand? Absolutely. I can't prove it. I'm just here to share what I know, and this is the best I know for now. Mm-hmm. How this connects to humility is important, because it's saying, for those of us who are surviving today, those of us who are alive in the flesh today, that we are walking to the beat of a different drummer. Who is our bottom line? What is our bottom line? Is our bottom line our own self concepts? Is our bottom line our own self-concepts, but we are discerning to look for a kind of truth that is beyond us? The second any of us, Christian or not Christian, are looking for a truth that is beyond, to which all humanity is accountable to, I'm that person's friend. Mm-hmm. As an Orthodox Christian, because that aligns us to being right-sized in the presence of this truth, whatever this is. Now, for you and me, and we've said this before in our discussions, you and I consider truth to be a person.
Yes. I want to go to the life of the Christ, because this associates with it a lot. When they came to catch him in Gethsemane, and Peter wanted to protect him, he said, "Don't do it." He humbly gave him up. And when they asked him questions, he didn't answer. He could have protected himself, say, "No, this is whatever you're witnessing against me is not right." But he was quiet. And then he also tells Peter that you are tying your rope now, and there will be time when somebody else will tie it for you and you will obey. To me, it's a growth from one spiritual level to another. Peter was the zealous one with the sword, and then a Peter who becomes a humble man and goes to the martyrdom. Do you think that this type of development happens in everybody's life? That at first you're zealous, you're very curious, you're righteous, and then the wisdom brings humility, or is there such?
Remember, wisdom is not just an intellectual enterprise. It is not just being smart. There are a lot of people out there who are very smart and high IQs and maybe a lot of education and a lot of skills and can do many wonderful things. And at the same time, they might not necessarily be very wise in the life-giving way. I know, and you know, many people, even in religious life and maybe in the academic world, who are brilliant people, and yet whose personal lives are a mess. Mm. And there's a major disconnect between our wisdom that we are gaining from book knowledge or academic study or intellectual prowess and the mess that we are not cleaning up in our own living room, our own homes. And so the kind of wisdom that we're trying to talk about has an integrity of not just in the mind, but also in being and also in our relationships and how we handle all our affairs and how we respond to all our affairs. So as you were talking about Peter, who was kind of hot-tempered and excitable, and reminds me of someone who would push himself to the line and try to, speak for the whole group. in sometimes a healthy impulse and sometimes maybe not such a healthy impulse, that as he surrendered himself to the love of God through time, that love of God helped the more authentic Peter that God had been creating and had been waiting for him to come through. And so many of his previous qualities stayed or were refined and made better. Other of his other qualities disappeared because he didn't need them and he grew out of them. And so the scripture does identify how maturing, putting on full stature of the man in Christ that the scripture talks about, changes us in a way that we cannot predict. And so being peaceful, and that's why humility is good, because humility keeps us supple. Mm-hmm. Humility keeps us vulnerable. And that's why sometimes it feels like when we are being humble, it doesn't always feel good. Sometimes it feels, like I said, we feel vulnerable. We might feel open in a way that's not comfortable. We might feel empty in a way that's not comfortable. What I tell my friends when we talk about this is, if this is what has to happen, then feel it as long as you're safe. You and your children are safe. Then allow everything else in your life to be up for grabs. Because it's as if when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable and open and like a child, we have to give God that space in our everyday lives to lead us through whatever we're working through to become the person that we're called to be once we cross on the other side of whatever that is. And sometimes it's being vulnerable and God changes us and we just have to sort of stay there and be supple. Mm-hmm. This is not easy. And it feels as if when we are open in this way that we are risking humiliation. That's what it feels like on our side. Humiliation for real and humility are two different animals. And so while from our experience sometimes it feels we're risking humiliation, we are feeling as if we are on the inside of humility. Sometimes it feels like self-effacement. But we'll call that healthy self-effacement. It feels self-effacing when I'm not so special. One of the first lessons in Christian monasticism, when a monk or a nun is brought into the community, is the stress, and this goes on for many, many years, and it's a Christian virtue, is the abbot or the abbess telling their spiritual child, do the best you can not to be a special case. Do the best you can, and I have a quote here from St. Anthony the Great. He says, if a person lacks extreme humility, if he is not humble with all of his heart, all of his mind, all of his spirit, all his soul and body, he will not inherit the kingdom of God. This is a very important point when one is trying to grow in the spiritual life. The other quote that I want to say to supplement that, because I don't want people to think that we can't make mistakes. I make mistakes all the time. We can make mistakes all the time. But let's be honest about them. Let's not just cover them up and say, well, humility is that admitting, and that's why it feels hard when we're wrong, when we're being egotistical, when we are being selfish. See yourself the same as the rest. And so not necessarily promoting mediocrity, but not necessarily also making ourselves a special case. It's a new insult now for me if someone says it calls me high maintenance. Mm-hmm. It's a new insult. It's saying I am not walking in humility if people see me as a high maintenance person.
Well, the question that I was getting while you were explaining is this, that Christ says when the city is on the top of the hill, you cannot hide it. Now, the example that you brought from the monks or nuns who suggest not to be special case is to kind of withdraw yourself out of the attention and to do whatever you're doing from behind. But eventually, like Christ says, if the city is on the top of the hill, you cannot hide it.
That's right.
It's going to come out.
That's right. And that's why walking this walk, open-handed, open-hearted, allows God to be the mover and the shaker and the one who brings those opportunities and who brings and who brings the spotlight when it's time, or brings the responsibility when it's time. One of the early Christian writers was having a discussion about why Joseph in the Old Testament, you know, the one who was sold for slavery, why it was Joseph's fault, why he was sold for slavery, and not his brother's fault. And according to this writer, he was sold into slavery, not, it was his fault that he was sold into slavery because of his humility. Because when his brothers threw him in the pit and found these traders to trade him off with, were selling their own brother, he had the ability to say to these traders, "I am their brother. You should not be doing this." But he never once admitted to these persons that he was their brother. And so by not saying anything, by not fighting their contempt, by knowing he wasn't wanted, and by knowing he wasn't wanted, not loved, they were not able to love him at that point.
If they didn't recognize him as a brother, he didn't want to be recognized as a brother.
He wasn't going to fight for it, even though he knew that he was their brother. He was not going to fight for it. So he allowed himself to be sold into slavery. And so, but the same writer said that even though it was that same humility, even though it allowed him to be sold into slavery, that same humility is what allowed him to become a ruler of Egypt later on. And so it's another way of walking that makes absolutely no sense to this world. The byproduct is life. That when we look behind, we see more life occurring, at least for us from our perspective, as opposed to less life.
When you explained that about Joseph, it kind of gave me this idea. If somebody is up on the hill as a city, it's really impossible to hide it. But if that person knows about humility and keeps himself humble, then there is no way this comes to answer the question that I had earlier. Nobody can step on that person, because in reality the person or the nation or whatever is up on the hill. You have to climb to reach, you cannot step on. So in some sense this comes to answer that humility has to be parallel to the greatness. One has to
authentic greatness.
Yeah, want to be great, want to be good, and in the meantime be humble, stay humble.
And we live in a society, not just the United States, but anywhere where we have technology, where we have cheap grace or cheap greatness, where celebrity is chased for its own sake, as opposed to allowing the greatness to occur. So celebrity, as we talk, could be seen as a cheap, a fake attempt at greatness, but a fraudulent greatness. Celebrity and greatness are not the same thing.
And so if somebody is a celebrity, won't they feel inside that they are not really great?
Correct. And so we do things to try to maintain our celebrity, our greatness according to the two-dimensional fallen world's understanding of greatness, and we wind up making ourselves more and more insane, or doing more and more insane things or acts to try to get back what we think we're losing, or try to grow in what we want. Whereas that's not great. That's demonstrating a lack of greatness.
Okay, and I have heard a story about Saint Francis of Assisi that after a while, when he was out helping people and preaching and stuff, he would come back and ask one of his disciples, take a stick and beat him and swear at him. Do you think this is a healthy thing? Because he felt probably that he's getting proud and he wanted to calm it down.
Well, if you didn't say it was St. Francis of Assisi,
You would say
I
so?
was absolutely, there's something wrong with that. But since you said it was St. Francis of Assisi, I don't know his context.
Okay.
And so I'm going to leave a lot of wiggle room that since he was at this stage of life that you're talking about, much holier and closer to God and a friend of God than I am, that there was something true and life-giving to that. But I would say if it wasn't St. Francis or some other saint, there may have been another way to do this. And let me just go back a second and say, if you were to come to my office, and I hope you do, to visit, because it's cute, it's a small little office, and I recently included in my office, I brought to my office my little Raggedy Ann doll. And so you'll come and you'll see my Raggedy Ann doll in the corner on a couch. And the reason why is because when I work with people or visit with people who come to see me for various reasons, a lot of the time there comes a point where we have to give up a lot of our preconceived notions of ourselves, which we're starting to grow out of, or they're not working for us. And we open ourselves up to something new where we're vulnerable and quivering and exposed. And as long as it's safe enough to proceed in life, I say stay safe, whatever that safety means, and quiver and be supple and have almost no spine, but just keep looking in the right direction. And then I pick up Raggedy Ann. I say, be like Raggedy Ann. And I shake her up and see, look, she has no, she's completely supple. She's completely agile to go where she needs to go. Because any stiff-neckedness, any holding on tight might deprive her of going to where she needs to go. And so sometimes humility verges on feeling like humiliation, but it's just the work. Mm-hmm. It's that work of not feeling special and just be one of the crowd. It's that work of, and be one of the crowd for a long time. Now, that's humility. When we are part of the crowd but are invisible, you're not welcomed as part of the group, that's a different thing. That's being humiliated, and that's something to be combated. Because as I said a few minutes ago, and I've said during other visits we both discussed, but I really want people to know there's a world, a universe of difference between life-giving humility and humiliation, which is a weapon of soul murder as far as I'm concerned.
Well, if I am humiliated, do you think I have a reason to fight against it? To make myself be recognized?
If we are humiliated, it depends on the context. Always we need to turn to God for help. And as we turn to God for help, we need help beyond ourselves if we are being humiliated. It often means also reaching out and asking for help from other people, be they good-willed persons in our own family or friends or professionals or others who have sought some kind of growth and healing that we recognize that we don't have, that we turn to. In AA, when and NA, Narcotics Anonymous and Alcoholics Anonymous, they talk about the moment when a person is ready to declare that they are completely powerless over their disease. Mm-hmm. That's an act of humility for real, but it feels like humiliation. And then to add insult to injury, because of how everything has to change radically from that moment on, what they have to do is ask for help. A, to declare this and turn to God for help, and then B, there's a little joke. They say, pick up the 500-pound phone and call someone and ask for help. Mm-hmm. And it's picking up that 500-pound phone that starts a whole universe of love and life into which we grow as time goes on. That is liberating and life-giving. That example from the 12-step world points to the bigger picture from a Christian perspective. There's a popular saying by many psychotherapists, psychologists, mental health specialists, when it comes to working with people who come to them for help. And the expression is, what is not acknowledged cannot be changed. Mm-hmm. And so oftentimes, when things are not working, when we can be stagnant in our lives, when we don't start asking, what else am I overlooking? What else in my life about me am I not acknowledging that might be getting in the way of my own life, my own relationships, so that I can start working on it? That in itself is an enormous step toward humility, or in humility, to ask, okay, what do I need to acknowledge so it can be changed, so I can become more me? More supple. Suppleness is often the first, one of the first fruits, inner suppleness. Mm. We talked about hardness of heart on different occasions in the past. And oftentimes, when parts of the heart start to thaw, it becomes more flesh-like, it becomes more supple and soft, and we are able to perceive more. We might be able to hurt more too, or hurt in different ways, but maybe we can contain more pain. And if we can have that ability where we learn to accept containing more pain, the paradox of the opposite also happens, and that is that we are also able to contain more love and offer more love and be a conduit for love.
Mm-hmm. I have two questions. I want to share with you this little story. In the beginning of the discussion, I mentioned about the Armenian Patriarch, Snork Patriarch of Constantinople, who was the previous patriarch mm-hmm. before the present one. He was an ascetic man and a very spiritual person, and he wrote diaries. Okay. From the moment of his ordination into priesthood, he starts talking about his ordination, how he feels after ordination. Actually, he was quite disappointed. He thought that ordination is going to change him, but then he says, well, I feel like I haven't been changed at all, and I have to work my way up. It wasn't any magic. But then he was appointed to be the student life director of the seminary. So one of the students was very mischief, and he says that he got angry with him. And he slapped him in front of everybody because he was causing a lot of problem. But then when he went back to his room, he started reflecting on it. What did he do? He humiliated this boy in front of everybody. Was it worth it to do this because of what he did? And so he called the boy into his room and said that he's sorry for it. He shouldn't have done this. It doesn't make him any better. What the student did was wrong. He makes it clear. But he says that he personally feels sorry for what he did. He shouldn't have done this. And he also recognizes it in front of everybody. Good. Because he had done in front of everybody. He apologized to the person in front of everybody. Good. And from this, he brings to another point. He says, I'm writing this because I have received a letter from my former student. He is now a patriarch, and writing about this. And he says that the student is complaining about the student life director, who is very ignorant, doesn't consider anything. He acts very stupid. And his suggestion is to pray for this person. He says, don't worry about any of his faults, giving suggestion to his former student or to his spiritual son. He says, don't worry about the wrong things that he does, because this shows that he needs our help, and we have to pray for him. That's the best thing we can do for him, because he's in a bad situation. He doesn't know what he's doing. And this reminds me of the prayer that Christ had on the cross. It says, Father, forgive them because they don't know what they are doing. So the humility that a human has, doesn't it really come from being so high up so that you can see everything from above and feel like you don't need to protect yourself. You will be justified anyways. And I would like you to have a parallel with the humility versus justice. Do I need to be just? Do I need to be justified in front of people or anybody? How important is justice in our life? If there is humility, if there is God's righteousness, Do we need to abide on God's righteousness and just be humble and everything else will be taken care of?
That's a loaded question.
Okay. I'll be
And
quiet and listen to the answer.
well, I won't have the answer. I'll have some ideas. When you say justice, are you meaning justice or are you meaning saving face?
Well, whatever you can understand in a point where you are feeling that you are a victim. Sometimes we feel like we are a victim, we suffer because of injustice of the world. And some people don't really care. They do whatever they're doing. And eventually everything gets solved. They say that time will solve the problems. But you have to be able to navigate within that time.
I think it depends on the situation and the people involved and what the context is and the maturity of the people involved. So there are many, many healthy ways that I think, or relatively healthy ways that can be possible. Sometimes we can only choose the least bad choice, and then we ask for God's help, and sometimes life brings that. But when you were saying justice, my mind was, I'll go first to the saving face. Sometimes, I think invisibility is a kind of a weapon of soul murder, and it is, according to the most recent research in psychology, when we emotionally abandon, neglect people, or treat them as if they are invisible, it is experienced by the psyche of the person as trauma. The whole field of trauma is now being redefined as a result of this new information that's really been a result of some very good research that's been coming out the past 5 or 8 years. Now, I can find lots of quotations from the early Christian ascetics and fathers and holy men and women from the history of the church that would be pointing to this phenomenon all along. And so for me, it's just this is corroborating evidence. It's very supportive to this information that's been that part of our inheritance, part of our tradition, as we talked about tradition last time. So there's the invisibility, the injustice of invisibility that happens. And I think we need to, if we are observing this, if we are seeing someone being treated in this way, in my experience, most of the time, it is very subtle but very powerful. But if it's noticed, even so, people look the other way because they don't want to get into a commotion. They don't want to confront the bully. Usually, there's someone in the bully or the powerful position versus the people or the persons who are being overlooked or abandoned or seen as invisible. And so, those of us who are observing this become part of the problem because we are not standing up to an injustice. And so there are times when being right-sized is to stand up to an injustice. Mm-hmm. And so, for example, David standing up to Goliath. Right? Mm-hmm. That's humility. Goliath, probably thought, who's this guy? Who's he? Who does he think he is? Well, oftentimes when we stand up to injustice, we're not so big ourselves. And it's very easy for the popular mind to say, who does he think or she think she is? And paradoxically, from an Orthodox Christian spiritual perspective, that's being humble when we stand up, being right-sized in the presence of God, to name what is going on and to stand with those who are being attacked and who are defenseless. There's that kind of injustice. Now there's another kind of injustice where, we get slimed. We get, we get, being part of the mundane world, people misunderstand us, people will gossip about us. And is that a fight that's worth fighting? A lot of the time, no. A lot of the time it's, for me, and I hate that, and for me, I know that I can tell that they are thinking less of me, or that I think I'm a loser, or they think I'm this, and I think I'm that. And then I say, are you going to try to defend yourself? And most likely make a fool of yourself because you're coming out of a reacting, insecure position. And number two, even if I were the most eloquent, the most articulate, the most truth-filled and peaceful person and radiating the love of God in that moment, they still wouldn't get it. You know, they still would be blind to it, and I would be feeding them because I'm giving them attention. And to leave the situation knowing I'm wearing that label, that doesn't feel good, but at the same time, turning that over to God, God does something with that through time. What? I don't know, but something. And it could be good in the long run for me.
Yes. You mentioned about picking up the heavy phone and calling to someone. I would like to have a little preparation for our next show that shows us that a human being needs help. And for applying for that help, we need humility.
Right.
So to pick up the phone, we need humility. And that phone is very heavy, like you said, 500 pounds, because we are proud. That's the weight of our pride that is on that phone. So I would like you to, we have only 5 minutes left, so if you would please give us some hints about the human relationship as a help. Why do I need to call somebody for help if I am feeling bad or stepped on or deprecated or whatever? Why is it important to have this help? Can't I just pray to God and hide my incompleteness or my faults from other people?
Well, I'm sure there are plenty of TV therapists that would say something like, well, is it working for you? And so if you or I, am praying to God and not reaching out for help and not changing and not doing anything different, but I'm praying really hard, well, these therapists on TV would say, is it working for you? Well, if it's not working for you, then something new has to happen. And it's that newness, it's that openness. And we all like feeling secure and familiar. That's okay, and that's human. And I think what humility is telling us is, in order for us to receive God, to be closer, to be open for the love of God to more deeply penetrate us, because a lot of that is us. God wants to lavish us with His love, but to do so would destroy us. And so God is waiting patiently for us to sort of open ourselves up so that He can find the right opportunity to lavish us with His love, even more than we are experiencing right now. And so it's that openness to the other, be it God or other persons, which means openness to change.
Thank you very much. Time is over now, and unfortunately we didn't finish this. And thank you, dear audience, to be with us and follow this discussion, because it is helpful personally for me very much. I'm discovering many things for my own life, and I'm sure that the audience are finding great treasures, diamonds here and there for their own life. Everybody has a different life and needs different suggestions. So thank you very much, Presbyteria, for being with us and giving us your time and explanations. And we'll continue this topic to show how the humility is present in the relationship between people and how it is helpful to be humble and confess who you are. Thank you very much for being with us, and we'll meet again next time.